Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what you want to see next.
The scene shifted to the space where Lu Sheng's body had been sucked in by the portal. The planets were beautiful, and everything seemed calm until two energies began clashing with each other. One was golden and the other purple and evil, each clash more powerful than the last, even capable of making the planets tremble. Within the energy were two powerful warriors, one in human form and another in beast form. Both moved swiftly and collided their fists against each other, creating a powerful flash capable of blinding anyone. The body of the human warrior was surrounded by golden martial fire. He was furious, clenching his fist tightly. He began concentrating his power into his fist and with an expression full of rage commanded the evil force to die. The demon's eyes were shining with malice, and his body seemed to be made of energy that was not from this world. He simply stepped back and began to show a confident smile, ready to receive the attack. The human warrior activated his power, making a circle appear behind his back. He gathered all his power in his hands, then brought them together to fire a powerful burst of energy toward the demon. The demon, who had been smiling before, had no time to react, and the burst of energy hit him squarely on the body. The attack was so powerful that his body began to burn, causing him to open his mouth and start screaming in agony. The burst of energy pushed what was left of the demon's body, and not long after, it reached one of the planets and struck the ground with force, shattering the area into pieces. He began to laugh, revealing that he was immortal and would never be destroyed. He could be reborn infinitely on this earth until the destruction of this world, vowing that he would return. In this world, it was nighttime, and the sky was beautiful. Back at the battle scene, the ground was filled with remnants of the demon. He had not died yet, and his eyes were still active. He started staring intently at the human warrior and couldn't help but feel furious. The powerful human warrior, whose body was surrounded by golden martial energy, descended onto the planet, and his attention focused on the remains of the demon. As moonlight illuminated the area, he couldn't help but feel relieved to see that finally the seal had succeeded. But then, something unexpected happened, and something began to approach the human warrior at great speed from behind. Upon feeling this, his eyes started to shine with seriousness, and he turned his head back to see what was happening. One of the martial flames that was on his body slowly began to fade away, and then the human warrior, who was Lu Sheng, lost consciousness and his eyes closed. His body began to fall toward the ground, and little by little the golden energy that was on his body started peeling off in pieces like the shell of a boiled egg. Our boy's body shot toward the ground and struck hard against the ice, creating a large curtain of smoke. Once the smoke screen disappeared, Lu Sheng could be seen inside the ice with his eyes closed. It seemed that he was still alive and had only lost consciousness. Back on Earth, Professor Nepson, who was sleeping like a log with his head resting on top of the table, suddenly woke up, throwing all the sheets from the folders into the air. His eyes were full of surprise and his mind filled with confusion. He began to sweat like crazy, put his hand on top of his head, and his eyes widened with curiosity. He let out a sigh without knowing if what he had just seen had been a dream. For him, the dream had been wonderful. As if it were a myth, the young man he had seen was strong and dazzling like the sun. He felt intrigued to know who he was. He opened his diary, grabbed a pen, and decided to write down the dream immediately so he would never forget it. He believed it was a divine revelation that God had secretly given to him. Just as he was about to write the dream in his diary, something happened. The ship tilted to one side, moving his table and causing all the books to fall to the floor. His eyes widened in confusion, not knowing what was happening. Once the ship stabilized, he started looking around and quickly realized that due to a great impact, the ship had stopped. His mind filled with curiosity, he got up from the chair and opened the door. Several crew members of the ship were running like madmen. With a surprised gaze, Nepson asked what was happening. One of the men, with a serious expression, revealed that the ship had collided with an iceberg. Professor Nepson adjusted his glasses. He was in shock and could not believe that such an advanced ship had collided with an iceberg. The ship's crew went out to the deck. In front of them was a large iceberg. Two men began to release the anchor. Professor Nepson also went out to the deck, approached the captain, and with a gaze full of fear asked what had happened and how they had collided with an iceberg, questioning how they were going to continue the journey. The captain remained calm, extended his hand toward his men, and with a tranquil gaze revealed that the ship had been dragged by an underwater current, which caused it to veer off course. But luckily, with the help of his team, the ship had only grazed the iceberg slightly. His eyes were shining with sincerity. With a smile, he asked the professor not to worry since the damage was not serious and they could continue sailing. Many questions came to the professor's mind. He began to observe the captain, asking why they had stopped the ship now. With a serious expression, the captain turned toward the iceberg, revealing that this iceberg was a bit strange since when they had grazed it a moment ago, he had seen something. Professor Nepsen's eyes widened in surprise, awakening his curiosity. He knew that the captain hadn't stopped the ship for having seen just an ordinary penguin. There must be something strange. The captain asked Professor Nepsen to look at it himself with his own eyes. Nepsen turned toward the iceberg, and with a curious gaze, he began adjusting his glasses. In front of them was a large iceberg, and inside it seemed to be a human body. Nepsen's eyes widened in surprise upon seeing this. He couldn't help but be in shock when realizing there was a person. He placed his hands on the ship's railing to see the iceberg more closely. He was speechless and swore that there was a person inside the iceberg. The eyes of the captain of the ship, who was behind, filled with fear and surprise, leaving him in shock. He could not move due to fear. The professor began to imagine the powerful human warrior Lu Sheng that he had seen in his dreams. His jaw dropped when he realized that the person inside the iceberg was the human warrior. He was identical to the one from his dreams, realizing that gods truly existed in this world. He turned towards the crew members of the ship, began pointing at the iceberg with his finger, and with a serene expression gave them the order to cut out the block of ice and take it to his laboratory immediately. The men were in shock, not knowing if this guy had lost his composure. In some room on the ship, someone was holding a glass of red wine. Due to the impact of the ship against the iceberg, the wine moved slightly inside the glass. The waiter, a man with purple hair, placed his hand over his chest and bowed his head in front of the man as a sign of respect, explaining that it had only been a small accident when brushing against the iceberg with the hull of the ship, which was nothing serious. But he revealed that inside the iceberg they had found the body of a Western man, adding that the body seemed very realistic. The man with black hair closed his eyes and prepared to take a sip of wine. With a calm expression, he mentioned that it was just a body of some Western barbarian, asking what was so special about it. The waiter raised his head and casually put his arm behind his back, mentioning that the body had nothing special about it. He had examined it and discovered that it was a very normal body, probably of a martial artist who had come to the Arctic Circle seeking to push their limits with some extreme training method but had ultimately frozen to death inside the iceberg. The man's eyes filled with boredom, and he looked away. The waiter seemed somewhat tired and had dark circles under his eyes, with a suspicious expression. He mentioned that although it was strange, Professor Nepsen seemed incredibly interested in the corpse, insisting that it was the body of an ancient god, talking about revelations and things like that. He had gone so far as to end the exploration immediately and return tonight. The man began pouring more wine into his glass and replied that Nepsen had always been a bit odd, saying that exotic beasts and warriors were products of myths. He decided to let him do whatever he wanted. He crossed his legs, grabbed the glass of wine, closed his eyes, and started laughing, as researchers like him always had some oddity. And besides, coming back early wasn't so bad since life on this ship was unbearably boring. The waiter put his hand over his mouth, closed his eyes, and also started laughing. The ship's crew cut out the piece of ice where our boy's body was frozen, then stored it inside a container and took it to Nepsen's laboratory, which was located on the lowest level of the ship. Nepsen arrived at his laboratory, and upon seeing Lu Sheng's body, he couldn't help but go into shock because he was completely identical to the warrior he had seen in his dreams. Our boy had his eyes closed to pretend. Nepsen approached the container and began to observe carefully. His eyes widened with happiness as every detail was identical. There wasn't a single mistake. He couldn't help but smile, thinking that this was the god of his dreams. He put his hand inside the pocket of his lab coat, took out his journal, and decided to record the scenes from his dream, but then thought it would be better to draw them. Nepsen pulled out a pen with an excited smile and started drawing and jotting down everything he had dreamed. According to him, this was the true origin of exotic beasts and the path of the martial artist. He was sure that once he published this, he would become the greatest scientist of this century. While Nepsen was distracted thinking about the awards he would receive for making this discovery, little by little, Lu Sheng began to open his eyes and a powerful purple energy started to emerge from one of his eyes. He used his ability called dimensional space, and thanks to it he could see the interior of the entire ship as if it were a model. While Nepsen was distracted writing in his journal, Lu Sheng began to scan the entire laboratory. His eyes widened in surprise because he discovered something fascinating. Somewhere in the laboratory, there was a cabinet full of containers with blue liquid. Inside, there were at least 100 bottles of exotic marrow liquid ranging from level 3 to 8, representing a fortune. Lu Sheng's gaze fixed on Professor Nepsen. just as our boy had imagined. Those working in scientific research always had abundant resources and funds at their disposal. Neptune had always been obsessed with the connection between myths and exotic beasts along with the path of the martial artist. He had always tried to prove it. He was someone superstitious and stubborn. At this moment, with just a bit of hypnosis and induction, he had managed to make this guy easily fall into the lies he had woven. When Lu Sheng had controlled Lai Dai's mind, her eyes had started to shine. Although Neptune held a high position in the research circle, at the end of the day, he was nothing more than an ordinary person with elevated status. Our boy never imagined that the improvised method he had used to deal with Lai Dai in the past would be so useful here. Neptune's eyes were full of joy. With an excited smile, he continued writing everything down in his journal. What followed now was simply to constantly reinforce suggestions between dream and reality, deepen hypnosis and brainwashing, and thus Neptune would become the most fervent believer of this ancient god. Suddenly, Neptune stopped writing in his journal. With a worried gaze, he realized that this was something only he had dreamed about. He could confirm the existence of the god but did not know how to make others believe him. He dropped his journal and pen on the floor and put his hands over his head. He couldn't help but panic. Only he had received the revelation. He didn't know how to prove it. Just a corpse wasn't going to be enough. He couldn't simply open up his own head and show the revelation to others. An idea came to his mind. He removed his hands from his head and with a surprised gaze, decided that the god himself would tell them. But letting the god tell everyone what had happened was somewhat of a complicated task. But for Neptune, a highly renowned scientist, it wasn't a problem. He could revive the god. And once the god descended again onto this earth, all doubts and falsehoods would be destroyed. Silence reigned for several minutes, until Neptune's eyes expanded and a light of hope began to shine. He sank into his thoughts for several minutes, until he struck his fist against his palm. He couldn't help but smile since there was nothing more convincing than a living god. He began to dance with joy around the vessel where Lu Sheng's body was, thinking he was a genius. He was determined to revive this god. His eyes began to shine with joy. He clenched his fist and with a confident smile, swore to make this world great again. In his mind, he was a genius. The god Lu Sheng started gazing at the ground and couldn't help but smile because everything was going according to plan.